Hey guys, so today's video was prompted by my friend TJ, who asked me about shooting 35mm film in a medium format camera, and rather than try to explain it to him directly, I figured I'd make a video so I could show everyone how I shoot 35mm film in a medium format camera. Today's film we'll be using is Kodak's E100 film. It's a slide film, great colors. I've used it a fair bit before. I really like this stuff. It's going to give us nice big wide transparencies that are going to look great on the light table. The camera today, we're using Pentax 6.7. Reasons for using this is because it's 6x7 and loads side to side, it's going to give us those nice wide pano-like negatives on 35, or rather positives on 35mm film. Alright, so things you'll need to shoot 35mm in a medium format camera will include a pair of scissors, some Scotch tape. I like to use double-sided tape. Single-sided might work okay too. 120 take-up spool. Some 120 backing paper, or 220 would work as well. That's initially where I kind of made the template from. I'll show you in a second. And the main thing is these, which is 120 to 35mm adapters. These are 3D printed. You can get them online for cheap, or if you have a 3D printer, you can make them yourself. There are schematics online. Okay, so my trick is using this 120 backing paper in order to shoot the full roll of 36 without wasting any film. So you take the backing paper, and you'll see what I've done is I've cut it down a little bit. I've cut this length here to be the same width as 35mm film, so it can actually recede into the canister as needed. The dimensions I'm using, I've got just over 18 centimeters here before I've made my own 220 start mark, and that's what we're going to do. We're going to trick the camera into shooting 220 film, which the Pentax 6.7 does great in order to shoot that whole roll of film. Yeah, so 18.5 centimeters to mark a 220 start mark, and then you can see the first 12.5 centimeters here is the width of 35mm film, so it can recede into the canister as needed. I've used about 2.5 centimeters here to taper it off up to that full length. Okay, so I'm going to take the 35mm film and just square off the end so it's less likely to cause any feeding issues in the camera. There we go, we've got a nice squared off end there. Here you can see how the 35mm adapters work. One pushes into one end and one into the other. This way it's about the same size as a 120 sprocket or 120 take-up spool. Alright, so once all the tape's been applied, we can attach our 35mm film. Making sure it's nice and straight. So once the film's on there nice and straight, it's ready to be rewound into the canister and loaded into the camera. This section of film is obviously all exposed already. This is just going to be our leader. That's just the film we have to waste loading it into the camera. But all the rest of the film that's in here should be able to be exposed by the camera. We're just going to retract this into the canister. Alright, now while it's incredibly hard to load this camera facing backwards, showing you guys the process, this is more or less what it should look like. You've got your adapted 35mm roll on one side, you've got the paper loaded onto the takeoff spool on the other, and the 220 start mark that we made is more or less aligned with the 220 indicator up at the top. With the Pentax 6.7, there's also a little tab on the side you need to switch into 220 mode. The backing plate, however, I leave in 120 mode just because 35mm film, I believe, is a little bit thicker and it's better backplate pressure for the process. Alright, so with the 220 mark aligned, we're going to close the back and advance the film. Alright, so that's it. With the camera all loaded up, we're going to go out there and shoot some 35mm. Okay, so I jumped in the Jeep and drove around town looking for some scenes to shoot. I was specifically looking for wider shots or lateral scenes, as I generally like a composition that fills the frame. It can be kind of tricky to visualize the composition when shooting a setup like this, as the top and bottom of your viewfinder aren't going to show up on the frame, and then also the frame is going to be partially blocked by the sprocket holes. Though I think in the end your mind ends up filling in the blanks of where the sprockets are. This method of shooting a 36 exposure roll of 35mm will give you 17 frames on a 6x7 camera. You can see here after the final frame the advance lever wouldn't go any further forward and it was actually locked forward. At this point I went home and in complete darkness opened up the camera back and wound the 35mm film back into its canister. If you remove the tape and paper, you could take the film to a lab like any other roll of 35mm. But in this case I heated up my E6 chemicals and developed the film at home. After developing, I scanned the film and here are the results. Alright, overall I think the shots turned out nicely. You can see that I generally tried to fill the wider composition with interesting detail. The new Kodak E100 captured some nice colors, but to be honest there weren't too many colorful scenes out there in the winter weather. Now, some people scan the frames without the film border and sprocket holes to give it more of a Hasselblad XPan sort of look. But I really do think scanning the full film gives you a more pleasant image and aspect ratio, one that's nice and wide but not to an extreme. For reference, let's look at the same image, but this time with the top and bottom film border cropped out. Preferences are totally subjective, so let me know what you guys think in the comments. Here's another image, this time with the border removed first. Now you can see when we add it back in, even though we're not adding much extra film area, it really presents as a much larger image despite the sprocket holes. Now, something to consider if you're doing these full bleed scans is that you can't cheat on composition and crop and rotate images during post-processing. Otherwise it's going to be super obvious, as you'll notice there's crooked or misaligned sprocket holes. So you really want to try to shoot the camera level to avoid a tilted scene. For those interested in lenses, I used a 55 f3.5 lens for some of the wider shots and a 90mm f2.8 lens for others. The 90mm is a pretty normal focal length for this system, but is slightly wider than the standard 105mm for the 6.7 system. The film itself was scanned directly on the glass bed of an Epson V800 scanner and held down with ANR glass. This shot was the last one on the roll, and probably my favorite image because of its pleasing color and the cool detail in these similar old trucks. Now, is it better cropped or uncropped though? This was the first time I've shot slide film in this way, though I've previously shot some black and white images I can showcase. I think these ones were scanned with a low-mode digital Lisa mask, so the scans are a tiny bit cut off at the top and bottom. Here we have a few images shot around town last summer with Ilford Delta 100. And I have a few more images from work shot with a roll of Kodak T-Max 400. Alright guys, thanks for watching. Hope you learned a thing or two and have a chance to try this process for yourself. If you have any questions, I can answer them in the comments. Take care, we'll see you next time.